Alright, today we're going to finish up the Kennedy administration, talk about Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society of the Vietnam War. The LBJ, Great Society, various legislation passed to include the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, Fair Housing Act, Medicare and Medicaid, the Vietnam War, the Gulf-Tonkin Resolution, the Tet Offensive, Earl Warren, Chief Justice, and get into the Nixon administration, talk about the SALT Treaty and Watergate. Alright, 1960s, it's a time of great unrest and civil rights. Summer of 1961 have what they call the Freedom Rides. These are a series of protests in the Deep South, which black and white civil rights activists rode in buses from one bus terminal to another across the South in order to try to desegregate these bus terminals. Because at the time, the law was interstate bus terminals were desegregated. That is, if you're traveling across state lines, you're traveling within a state, though. Most of these southern states, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, among others, you had whites-only waiting rooms and black-only waiting rooms. The idea here is they would ride together and go to these waiting rooms together. What ended up happening was, when they got these different bus stations, they had these angry white mobs sitting there, and they would pelt them with bricks, 2x4s. Some of them were, and of course the civil rights activists were the ones who were arrested for disturbing the peace. Some of whom were beaten in jail, probably even worse. Police in these cases stood idly by and let civil rights protesters be beaten. You got 1962, University of Mississippi. Here, in this case, Governor Ross Barnett filed a federal court order refused to allow an African-American student and Air Force veteran, James Meredith, to attend the University of Mississippi. He's trying to segregate the university. The federal court said he has to be enrolled, but Ross Barnett says he won't be. Threatening another series of violent confrontations like there was in Central High and elsewhere. So the Attorney General at the time, Robert F. Kennedy, ordered federal marshals in to enforce the court order, and Kennedy had to do a lot of careful diplomacy with Barnett just to get Meredith admitted without incident. So Meredith was later killed. Car bombing, shooting at his house. Presumed white supremacist, but no one is ever caught. Ironically, Ross Barnett, they named a huge reservoir outside of Jackson after him. Birmingham, Alabama became the most notorious area for civil rights activities. Look here, page 1010. It's all the violence and bombings of homes and churches. It came to be called civil rights activist Birmingham. Now, there's this one incident in the early 1960s. Sunday morning, somebody threw a bomb into the basement of a black church in Birmingham, killed 4 little girls. But there continued protests in Birmingham as African Americans marched for more rights, protection of the law. Police usually attacking the crowd using water cannons, tear gas, dogs on peaceful protesters. You can see here the picture from 1963. Police department here using his attack dog to attack this protester. Notice very clearly that civil rights marchers here, they are well dressed, they are not armed, not making any kind of threatening moves or threatening gestures of any type, but the police are sticking dogs on them. This is caught on nationwide television. So the police chief of Birmingham, Bull Connor, became a perfect foil of brutality against King's nonviolent tactics. Martin Luther King won a lot of sympathetic whites to his cause, as TV footage showed these peaceful protesters as being attacked mercilessly. So in the summer of 1963, King and 250,000 supporters organized a march on Washington for equal justice for all Americans. It was here at the Lincoln Memorial delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Now Kennedy had been pushing for a more sweeping civil rights bill, but conservatives in the Republican Party and conservative Democrats in the Deep South kept blocking the measure for the filibuster. Basically, they made 2/3 majority vote to push anything through. Actually, in the late 1963, the bill still stalled in Congress. Also, in November 1963, Kennedy's preparing for re-election in 1964. Started to shore up a widening breach in the Democratic Party there. Because remember, the Democratic Party is one of composed of several different factions. It isn't just simply one monolithic party with one complete ideology. So in Texas, you had the conservative wing of the party, led by the state's governor, John Connally, and the liberal wing, led by Senator Ralph Yarborough. Back when the Civil Rights Acts were passed under the Johnson administration, Yarborough would be one of only 2 Southerners to even vote for the civil rights laws. Well, Connally and Yarborough were constantly at each other's throats, criticizing each other, always trying to undermine the other one. And this left moderates like Lyndon Johnson, real big, hugely powerful figure in the state, kind of left in the middle, and he had trouble keeping the two sides together. But what was worse, though, for Dallas in particular, was it's a hotbed of right-wing activity. And so the ambassador to the United Nations and former governor of Illinois, Adlai Stevenson, had visited Dallas a couple years earlier, and he was beaten up by protesters. Dallas was also the headquarters of the Ku Klux Klan. It was also the headquarters of the John Birch Society. Basically, the John Birch Society is an extreme anti-communist organization, basically a little more than the Ku Klux Klan in 3-piece suits. And so you have all these criticisms of Kennedy being a communist, a traitor. 1960, when Lyndon Johnson's wife were giving a speech at a hotel in Dallas, Republican protesters swarmed around him, jostled and spit on him. The United States Senator and his wife are spitting on him, while the Republican candidate for Senate that year, John Tower, sat there and cheered it on. So, Kennedy arrives, been giving several speeches in Texas, Fort Worth, Dallas, Austin, and San Antonio. And so the first wing of the trip is going very well. Gone to San Antonio the night before, now they're in Fort Worth the morning of November 22nd, and so far everything's been going really well. Except Kennedy gave a brief speech at Fort Worth, charming the crowds there. And a parade was arranged in Dallas for the president to greet the crowds. So the president flew the short 30 miles from Dallas to Fort Worth, Dallas to their major airport there, Love Field. And he's in this parade, this open-air car. The parade route had been announced in the local papers for weeks beforehand. But also, in addition to the parade routes on November 22nd, the Dallas Morning News, a prominent Dallas conservative businessman placed a full-page ad calling Kennedy a traitor and saying he should be arrested. In fact, the man who fitted this ad well into the 1980s. Now, all this is because of the Democratic Party's new reception of civil rights nationally, expanding federal social welfare programs, and renunciation of the brinksmanship and the war hawk stance that the Kennedy administration had been pushing. It has tried to push for understanding of the Soviet Union and coexistence rather than just simply pushing the button and blowing at each other's kingdom come. So crowds mildly cheered Kennedy's motorcade as they drove through downtown Dallas. Suddenly, at least 3 shots rang out, mortally wounding Kennedy. He was rushed to Parkland Hospital, where he died minutes later. Basically, the bullet wounds to the brain were could not survive them. Connally was in the car with Kennedy, because he and Yarborough hated each other so much they had to rearrange all the seating arrangements. Connally with Kennedy and Johnson with Yarborough. But Connally is severely wounded in the attack. Shortly afterward, Lee Harvey Oswald, a deranged employee at the school book depository where the shots apparently emerged from, was arrested. Oswald's a very strange party. He defected to the Soviet Union in the 1950s, but returned a few years later. His motives were never really clear. What was clear, though, was the reaction. Like I say, there were schools in North Dallas and conservatives applauding the death of Kennedy. Well, 2 days later, a local nightclub owner named Jack Ruby killed Oswald on live national TV. He's being transferred from the city jail to the county jail. So theories have abounded ever since on whether Oswald acted alone. Because it's basically been a cottage industry, everyone trying to assume something different, trying to assume just what actually happened there. Well, the main suspect, Oswald, is dead. And Johnson unveiled what they called the Warren Commission. It's headed by Chief Justice Earl Warren, included several prominent politicians, attorneys, and forensics experts. The Warren Commission's report in 1964 was very controversial. Basically, it came out with what's called the magic bullet theory. It said that there were 3 shots, and a lone gunman, presumably Oswald, was responsible for the death of President Kennedy. Oswald. Harvey Oswald. Still, theories persisted. In 1978, Congress re-examined the findings of the Warren Commission, the investigations of other prominent assassinations, particularly his brother Robert F. Kennedy in 1968, Martin Luther King also in 1968. The congressional conspiracy examining the Kennedy assassinations found no hard evidence of any conspiracy. Suggestions of something, but couldn't find any hard evidence. So in the months afterward, Dallas got the reputation as the city that killed Kennedy. Again, it's because of that activity happening before that's why Dallas got the reputation as the city that killed Kennedy, why Buffalo, New York didn't get the reputation as the city that killed McKinley. Or Washington, D.C. is the city that killed Garfield. In fact, for a while, having a Texas license plate while being out of state was enough to get your tires slashed to get beaten up because of what happened. But the nation had lost a popular and beloved president. Lyndon Johnson was then sworn in as the 36th president of Air Force One. the only president ever sworn in on an airplane, and ironically, the only president ever sworn in by a woman, a federal judge, Sarah T. Hughes. Well, Johnson quickly returned to Washington as the nation endured the grief of losing a national hero. Now, Kennedy and Johnson agreed, by and large, on a wide range of issues. They had kind of a grudging respect for each other. But Johnson and Robert F. Kennedy, like I said, they really didn't like each other much at all. But one of Johnson's primary focuses was civil rights. You say where Kennedy had the poetry to describe a vision, it's Johnson who had the legislative know-how to really make it happen. Here on page 1016, 1017. Johnson's this huge man, like 6'4", and he liked getting right up in people's faces, kind of intimidating them a little bit. He could charm them and bully them at the same time. He knew how to use enough pull to get people to support bills. In fact, there's this one story he had. This one aide came to him and said this one congressman of Texas wasn't going to back a particular bill. Johnson looked at him and said, "You call him back and tell him Air Force bases can be given, and Air Force bases can be taken away." So the guy calls him back and tells this congressman this. Congressman laughs, says, "He keeps telling me that all the time." But he turned around and voted for the bill anyway. Johnson's domestic reform program is called the Great Society. He's elected to Congress in 1937 from a district in Central Texas, a devout supporter of the New Deal. But when he's elected to the U.S. Senate from Texas, what rest of the state is much larger and much more conservative than the Austin area, he had to throttle back a lot of his reformist impulses. But now President of the United States, he's president of a nation that's much more liberal than the state of Texas, and mourning the death of Kennedy, he's going to basically retool all Kennedy's initiatives and make them his own and pass them. In fact, a lot of Johnson's plans actually were Kennedy proposals. Johnson's the one who had to get it through. Among other things that's happening here is the 24th Amendment ratified in 1964. It's an important constitutional amendment that outlaws poll taxes. We're talking about disfranchisement at the beginning of the semester. Ordering people to pay $1 to be able to vote. Texas and Arkansas are among the last states to have this in place because it's tied to school funding. But the 24th Amendment said no poll taxes. You do not have to pay money to register to vote. Now, the Johnson administration and other civil rights supporters pushed for the passage of a sweeping civil rights commission. Initially, congressional conservatives resisted the usual parliamentary delays, but in February 1964, the House passed the Civil Rights Act by a vote of 290 to 130. It was passed on a bipartisan basis. You have Democrats and Republicans voting for it, but also have a lot of coalition of Democrats and Republicans opposing as well. Now, conservatives tried to derail the bill for a filibuster. For the first time, the Senate was able to break the filibuster and pass the Civil Rights Act in the Senate by a vote of 73 to 27. And you have deep divisions of both parties rising over the bill. Everett Dirksen, who's the Republican minority leader from Illinois, voted for the bill, and the Republican presidential frontrunner Barry Goldwater of Arizona voting against it. Bills passed with backing such prominent Southern Democrats as Lyndon Johnson and Texas Senator Ralph Yarborough. But Texas's other senator at the time, Republican John Tower, voted against it. This is what the Civil Rights Act does. It's the most sweeping Civil Rights Act in U.S. legislation in U.S. history. It gives the Attorney General additional powers to protect citizens against discrimination and segregation voting. by the use of all public facilities. Basically, segregation is banned under this act. So there's not going to be any more discrimination in housing or education, anything else like that. Equal rights guaranteed under law regardless of race, color, creed, or sex. Equal rights for women is guaranteed under this act. That's, among other things, is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, also commonly called the EEOC. That is to make sure there's no discrimination in hiring or salaries or promotions. Segregation is banned in transportation, schools, hotels, churches, restaurants, employment, protecting the rights of women and minorities alike, ensuring they not be discriminated against. Although most Americans are pleased by the passage of the law, backlash against the civil rights movement began. Summer of 1964, 24 African-American churches in Mississippi were firebombed. Many whites in the North became resentful of the direct action protests in their own communities against the protests. Segregationist Governor George Wallace of Alabama made strong showings in the Wisconsin, Maryland, Indiana primaries as a result. Protest demonstrations against police brutality in the North spread, and the riot broke out in New York City. After race riots became a common feature in a lot of cities in the 1960s. Martin Luther King had won a lot of victories for the civil rights movement, but frustration of many African Americans began to boil over and spin out of control. Made even worse by the fact the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, as an ardent segregationist, promised that King would never have another peaceful protest in the United States again, and began sending in disruptors to infiltrate his marches and start trouble. So get to the election of 1964. Johnson, nominated by the Democrats. Now, he's been a powerful figure in the Senate since he was elected there in 1948, but when he became vice president of the election in 1960, he's very frustrated with the limitations of the role of vice president, but already by the summer of 1964, he scored a number of important achievements. There's some move to make Robert Kennedy the vice president, the attorney general, but Johnson refused because of the animosity between the two. And looking for extreme loyalty on the ticket, he goes with the Minnesota Senator Hubert H. Humphrey instead. Robert F. Kennedy is going to be elected senator from New York that year. Well, the Republican Party had a deep split between the moderates and the conservatives, and then going with Barry Goldwater of Arizona, the conservative. So over a liberal, more moderate figures like Nelson Rockefeller of New York. Well, Goldwater rattled several nerves at the convention. He proclaimed in a speech that extremism in the pursuit of liberty is no vice. Kind of extremism they saw in recent years is something Americans were not looking for. Goldwater followed up with the phrase, but restraint in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. A lot of Americans fear that Goldwater might promote some new Red Scare or take away some new deal protection such as Social Security, and particularly when he's going to Tennessee saying he's taking away the TVA, which was the largest power company in Tennessee and employed thousands of people across the state that didn't win him a lot of fans. Ironically, Goldwater in later years, something of a maverick, considered to be father of the conservative movement of the Republican Party, became something of a moderate. He had spoke out for gay rights and abortion rights, irritating a lot of social conservatives in the Republican Party, basically helped put in power. But Johnson portrayed Goldwater as extremist, suggesting through Goldwater's very statements he'd start a war with the Soviets. We had this one commercial he ran called the Daisy commercial. being an election year, you'll probably see it. Starts off this little black and white film, this girl in a field, probably about 4 or 5, counting it, pulling these flowers off daisies, count out 1, 2, 3, and gets up to 10 and cuts off to the scene that's counting off the loudspeaker, 9, 8, 7, 6, this huge nuclear explosion. Post something the words, vote for President Johnson on November 4th. Stakes are just too high. Like I said, the commercials run only once. Like I say, outcry caused the Johnson campaign to pull it, but people kept talking about it, seeing it over and over again on the news. It's a very effective negative ad, but well, I still talk about it 50 years later. But it fed into the narrative they had about Barry Goldwater when he started war with the Soviet Union. Johnson supporters switched around the Goldwater slogan, in your heart you know he's right, to in your heart you know he might. Well, Johnson ended up racking the largest percentage of any presidential candidate ever, 61.1% of the vote, getting 486 electoral votes to Goldwater's 38.5% of the vote. Walloping Goldwater. Goldwater be in the Senate until the 1980s, but presidency goes to Johnson. Slogan LBJ for the USA. But the South starting to turn Republican after the Civil Rights debate. In fact, Alabama basically went from being one-party Democratic to being one-party Republican practically overnight. In fact, the states that Goldwater did win, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, had previously been overwhelmingly Democratic. In fact, LBJ won Franklin Roosevelt won South Carolina in 1932 with 90% of the vote. But what changes? Civil rights. Conservative white voters didn't want the Civil Rights Act. Well, Johnson ends up passing 2 other important pieces of civil rights legislation. The Voting Rights Act in 1965, which basically dismantled all remaining impediments to voting, such as literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and so forth. Basically, open registration laws. And so because of this, African-American voter participation soared. Going from only a handful of percentage points in the mid-1960s to registration rates approaching 70-80% of the 1970s. Voting Rights Act also put into law the principle of one man, one vote. That is, the idea that districts could not be drawn in order to dilute minority voting streams. This is to make sure all communities had a fair chance of participation in the legislative process. So for years, this meant that southern states had to send legislative and congressional district maps to the U.S. government for approval. Fair Housing Act of 1968 forbade discrimination in housing, renting, or loans. It's trying to end the practice of redlining. From loans trying to keep African Americans from buying homes or buying outside of particular neighborhoods. In fact, you see a lot of bank commercials today where it says equal housing lender. That comes from the Fair Housing Act of 1968. But Johnson's domestic reform program, the Great Society, had an indelible effect on America. 1962, Michael Harrington's book, The Other America, estimated there were 35 million Americans living in poverty. In response to this and Johnson's own bitter memories of the bring up poverty of the Great Depression, he announced what he called the War on Poverty in 1964. Basically, mailing a series of programs to bring direct aid to the needy, and a series of programs to help poorest Americans develop job skills, education skills, improved housing, basically lift them out of poverty. Programs included such things as neighborhood daycare centers, consumer education programs, legal aid services. In fact, legal aid, that was a case started by the Johnson administration. Adult literacy programs, Job Corps for high school dropouts. That was a Great Society program. Head Start. Basically give poor children a chance of getting into decent preschool, help them with their foundations for education. That started through the Great Society programs. Yeah. Job Corps, that was Johnson. AmeriCorps, that was Bill Clinton.
Okay.
At Head Start, though, Clinton was a big supporter of that also, but Johnson started that. Federal aid for education increased sharply, primarily aimed at poor students. Pell Grants. You're on Pell Grants. You're here in college because of Lyndon Johnson. Those were passed in 1965. Probably two of the most famous programs, Medicare and Medicaid. Now, Johnson initially was pushing for a program which provided universal health care coverage for everybody, but the American Medical Association came out against it. Instead, they came up with the two compromise bills, Medicare and Medicaid, over 1965. Medicare provides medical care for those over age 65. And Medicare is a medical care for poorest Americans. But health insurance for the middle classes and for the upper classes was not provided. It was basically the middle class lived in the lurch again. But what happened, though, Medicare combined with Social Security helped end a lot of major problems that the elderly were facing in the United States at this point, which was high medical bills, and limited buying power because so many are on a fixed income. So with Medicare, people, the elderly were able to enjoy much healthier retirement years. It helped expand the life expectancy in the United States. Okay, Medicaid, making sure that the poorest Americans would have some kind of they wouldn't be dying and bleeding to death in the streets because they couldn't afford it. With the Affordable Care Act under Obama, Medicaid had been greatly expanded in many states to be able to give those who aren't quite as poor, those who are in the middle class, an opportunity to afford health insurance. Now, because of Lyndon Johnson's programs, this coupled with the increases in minimum wage, poverty rate in the United States dropped by a third. From the 10 million Americans coming out of poverty, Great Society was working. In fact, when Johnson leaves office and Richard Nixon cuts back on all the Great Society programs, poverty rates start going back up again, and showing just how many Americans needed these programs. But you also see during this time period is a lot of activity from the federal bench, particularly the Supreme Court led by Chief Justice Earl Warren. Actually been an Eisenhower appointee. They're probably most famous for the civil rights ruling, particularly Brown versus Board of Education, which ended school desegregation, and other cases regarding desegregation of schools, which they supported. But there are a lot of other important rulings from the Warren Court regarding civil liberties. So he was Chief Justice for 15 years, 1953 to 1968. Next, we talked about Brown versus Board of Education, but there's also such decisions as which have the Gideon versus Wainwright case in 1963. This case required that the state provide a lawyer for every defendant in a criminal case, regardless of their ability to pay. Came from a case of a man named Gideon in Mississippi. He was convicted of burglary, given a long sentence in a Mississippi prison, but because he was poor, he couldn't afford an attorney. So he wrote to the Supreme Court saying he didn't have an attorney, couldn't mount an effective defense that he was innocent. So in these days before the Gideon case, basically, if you couldn't afford a lawyer, you basically just have to plead your case yourself before a judge, just beg for mercy. But the Supreme Court agreed to hear Gideon's case, and they agreed that this case, Gideon versus Wainwright, that because of this, every defendant should have an attorney. The state's accusing you of crime, they should provide you an attorney. Basically, Sixth Amendment. What ended up happening was they ordered a new trial for Gideon. The state of Mississippi had to provide an attorney for Gideon, and in the new trial, Gideon was acquitted. This led to a whole slew of cases across the country in which people who had been convicted without an attorney granted new trials, this time with state-supported attorneys, and a lot of innocent people were turned loose because of that. Similar case, Miranda versus Arizona in 1965. This case stated that all suspects had to be informed of their rights when they're taken into custody. They are called Miranda rights. So they see them on TV, and they say, somebody say you have the right to remain silent and so forth. It's Miranda rights. Basically, inform of your rights. You don't have to say anything to incriminate yourself. You have the right to an attorney. So on and so forth. Basically, it's an extension of the Gideon case. Two other cases. One of them is Engel versus Vitale, 1962. It's a case involving school prayer. What happened was, in the 1950s, the state of New York passed a law saying that students had to recite a particular prayer in school every day, one written by the state of New York. Basically, it was trying to show a defiance against communism, the official atheism of the communist state, the Soviet Union. But what the case said here was, the ruling was, the state cannot compel the student to pray in school. The student can pray on their own. This was commonly misunderstood as students can pray on their own, but the state cannot say, this is the time you'll pray, this is the prayer you'll read, this is the God you will pray to. The state cannot do that. The state cannot take an official position on a religion. It cannot say, you have to say this prayer, you have to pray to this God. Now, if a student does that on their own, that's their own business. That's their freedom of religion. But the state cannot say, you have to do this. There's a big difference. But unfortunately, that has been commonly misunderstood for years because a lot of people are just trying to raise money off it. Yeah.
Could that be extended to the Pledge of Allegiance?
Some people have been trying to say that. Whether it is or not, that's still being determined by the courts. Because in the 1950s, they added the phrase, under God, into the Pledge of Allegiance. The original Pledge of Allegiance didn't have that. It also said, in God we trust, but only in 1952, it can show defiance against communism. But whether this applies to the Pledge of Allegiance or not, is still being debated. But a state-mandated prayer, such as what the state of New York and the other states also were pushing, that's unconstitutional. See, as a public official, I can't say, get on your knees and pray right now. I can't do that. But if you want to pray on your own, if you're not disrupting the classroom, I can't stop that. And that's your right. See? because you can see the obvious danger of this. In fact, this case is brought by, a lot of these cases like this are brought by Jehovah's Witnesses and the Seventh-day Adventists. Because suppose that you're being asked to pray for something you don't believe in. Suppose you're being asked to pray to the state's mandate or to have high black mass to Satan here. So most of you would be very offended by that, which and obviously refuse to participate. It's an extreme example, but it's the kind of things that Engel versus Vitale is trying to prevent. It is people not be forced to proclaim a religion or a practice religion they don't believe in. Also, case New York Times versus Sullivan. This is 1964. Has to do with libel laws. This is an important shift in free speech in the United States. In this case, they said that to prove libel, you have to meet two criteria. One, intentional malice, and two, reckless disregard of the truth. Two criteria you have to meet. Now, there's a difference. Remember, slander, that's something that's spoken. Slander is spoken. Libel is written or printed in some way. That's why most of these cases go, is because libel is something that's written down, you can see, you can study. But it's more than just simply making a mistake, just saying something that's in error. You have to say you did it intentionally to destroy someone's reputation. Absolute reckless disregard of truth. That's why you may notice on newscasts there's some big scandal and they say such and such was unavailable for comment or repeated attempts to reach such and such were unsuccessful. That's basically how they're getting past intentional malice. They say, we heard a rumor about somebody, several people confirmed it, but the person who is being directed against would not respond to it. So giving that man's attempt to respond to attack on his character, true or not, like I said, the reporters, the newspapers, and TV stations tried. Where we say you're absent of malice because you try to get their side of the story. Reckless disregard of the truth means it has to be knowingly false. That is, you're printing something you know is a lie. That you know is going to damage their reputation. Like I say, that is reckless disregard of the truth. Now, of course, when it gets to public officials, people who are elected, the laws will be different. Satire is a defense for public officials and celebrities, so that's why they can go on Saturday Night Live and all those shows and just say absolutely anything they want about somebody because satire. But a public citizen, though, ordinary Joe on the street, they're deliberately lying about somebody, doing an attempt to destroy a reputation, either media outlet or individual person or organization. That's libel. They get in a lot of trouble for that. So important changes in the First Amendment and rights of criminal defendants in the 1960s cover this. But although a lot of progress is made in the 1960s, helping the poor, basically reducing poverty rates by a third, helping the elderly, expansion of education, civil rights. The Johnson administration was severely damaged by the Vietnam War. Now, American involvement in Vietnam had been going on for many years before the Vietnam War exploded in the 1960s. Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, those three little countries in Southeast Asia, had been colonized as French Indochina in the 1800s by France. During World War II, Japan occupied that area, and in fact the United States sent Lend-Lease aid to Indochina so they could fight the Japanese. But after the war, the French reoccupied the region. The Vietnamese were fighting for independence and fought to evict the French. So in 1946, the Vietnamese independence leader and communist Ho Chi Minh formed an organization called the Viet Minh, designed expressly to expel the French from Indochina. So it's a covert guerrilla war against the French. May 1950, the Truman administration sent France $10 million to fight Ho Chi Minh because the French are saying they're trying to fight a communist insurgency because of the containment policy. Truman is supporting the effort by France to put down Ho Chi Minh. It's an independence movement for Ho Chi Minh, but it's a communist insurgency for France. Kind of a matter of perspective. Well, by March 1954, French soldiers were pinned down at Dien Bien Phu, a fortress in northern Vietnam. France appealed to the United States and Britain, but President Eisenhower refused to involve the U.S. in another Asian land war so soon after Korea. British also refused. Eisenhower feared that direct intervention would compromise the U.S. tradition of anti-colonialism. He also feared that division after division would be swallowed up into the jungles of Indochina. So on May 7, 1954, the French surrender. The International Peace Conference divided Vietnam to 17th parallel. So you've got Laos and Cambodia are independent. You also have North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Again, divided to 17th degree North parallel. North Vietnam, South Vietnam. Now, North Vietnam is controlled by Ho Chi Minh. South Vietnam is nominally a republic, but it's basically a little more than a dictatorship. Very corrupt, very oppressive regime, very unpopular. But reunification elections for North and South Vietnam are scheduled for 1956. Here's the kicker. South Vietnam and the Eisenhower administration realized that Ho Chi Minh was so popular in Vietnam, he'd win the election with 80% of the vote, so South Vietnam would go communist. Here's the... you got to understand the way the Vietnamese saw it was Ho Chi Minh was like a George Washington-like figure. He was their hero who fought off the foreign invaders. But see, the problem is North Vietnam and South Vietnam have a horrible civil human rights record for both countries. So they're not. So for South Vietnam, isn't a whole lot. They don't see a whole lot of benefit to democracy or the free market system. They're half-starved, they're poor, living under a corrupt regime. The situation's just getting worse. So the reunification elections are canceled. The North organizers came called the Viet Cong and launches these guerrilla attacks to try to destabilize the government of South Vietnam, prompting Eisenhower by 1957 to start sending in military advisors to help train the South Vietnamese army. Steadily, American involvement expanded into the Kennedy administration, where these advisors are now going out on missions with the Southeasters to see how they were responding under pressure. Then escalates in 1964 with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Unfortunately, we're out of time for now.